Have you ever wondered what chess would be like if you could move your pieces back through time to previous boards?
No.
Yeah, probably not, but the concept must come across as nearly impossible for the human brain to understand, right? You might be wrong. It's surprisingly easy to wrap your head around it once you get the basics of piece movement as well as some key concepts for how the game of 5D chess works. So this video should be a good one-stop shop for everything you need to know to get started in 5D chess. I'll hit you with the key concepts of the game, the basics of piece movement, and a couple tips on how to use them effectively, as well as a quick and easy opening set of moves to get you started so you don't lose in the first 4 turns. So let's dive in. What is time travel in this game, and how do we even use it?
What do you know about time travel?
In theory?
In practice.
So there are 3 important things we need to know about creating these new parallel boards, often referred to as parallel timelines.
Oh, just so you know, Jeff, you were not creating 6 different timelines.
Of course I am, Abed.
The first thing we need to understand is where do these timelines appear? So if our opponent creates a timeline, it will appear above the main timeline. If we create a timeline, it will appear below the main timeline. The second thing we need to understand are inactive or exiled timelines. So on the example here, you'll see there's one board that has a black arrow running behind it as opposed to the regular purple. This indicates that it is an inactive timeline. Why is it inactive? It's inactive because the black pieces have made one additional board more than the white pieces have. So we can see they have 2 boards that they've created above the main timeline. White has 0 boards created below the main timeline. So that second board that they've created will be inactive until white creates a timeline of their own, at which point it will become playable. The last thing we need to understand is this big bar that says the present on it. It will be located at the furthest back active board, and it indicates what boards must be played on to progress the turn forward. So we can see here, this board here must be played on as white to move the turn forward. Boom. So now we understand the dimensions and timelines in the game. But we're not just fighting against time here.
We're fighting time itself, and I'm gonna win!
We're fighting against a real opponent. So how do we actually win the game? We win the game by putting our opponent into a position where no matter what they do, we are going to be able to capture one of their kings throughout any part of the timelines on our turn. What does that look like? Basically this. If I move this queen here, we're actually going to win the game because we can capture both this king or this king, and no matter what move our opponent makes, it won't be able to prevent us from capturing one of these 2 kings. This will make a lot more sense as we go through the different pieces, and I'll show you a couple different ways to checkmate your opponent as we go through them. So now that we understand how the dimensions in the game work, how to travel through time, how to win the game, we can look at the individual pieces and how they move. While I explain how the pieces move through time and parallel boards, try and relate that back to how the pieces move on a 2-dimensional board. You'll find there's actually a very, very close link between the 2. The more pieces we go through, the clearer this link will be. So let's start with the rook. The rook moves in 1 dimension at a time, as far as it wants to, until it hits another piece. So what does that look like on the 2D board here? Basically, up and down, left and right. Very simple. If it hits one of our pieces, stops before it. If it hits another piece, it captures it. Same thing applies through time and through parallel boards. So let's look at this rook here. This rook can move to the same square in the board above it, or the same square through time. Super, super simple. You'll notice it doesn't move to another position on these boards, because then it would be moving in 1 dimension back through time and 1 dimension on the board. So that'd be 2 dimensions, rooks will only move in 1. So this can be really useful if you're in a bit of a sticky situation, like we find ourselves here. But don't worry, we're not dead yet.
I'm not dead!
Yeah, he says he's not dead.
Thankfully, we put our rook on this position here. This position has never been taken in the entire game. So we can bring that rook all the way back to the beginning of the game. And then all we have to do is hope that we can beat our opponent or we catch back up to where we were losing.
He isn't? Well, he will be soon. He's very ill.
I'm getting better.
No, you're not. You'll be stone dead in a moment.
The bishop. The bishop moves in 2 dimensions at the same time until it hits another piece. So on a 2D board, it moves diagonally, i.e. in 2 directions. If we go back in time or down to parallel boards, it moves 1 board back and then 1 square on that board. Moves 2 turns back, it'll move 2 squares on that board and propagating backwards. Don't panic, there's another little weird rule. It'll move 1 dimension back in time, then 1 dimension down or up to parallel boards. Since that's 2 dimensions of movement, it stays in the same spot that it was in its original place. See, no reason to panic. Now, the bishops can be very effective in attacking your opponent's king. You'll notice that on our opponent's side, they've left this back row to their king very exposed.
Wait, why don't you just do your thing and time travel us out?
Good idea. Let's place our bishops on that back row. Boom. We get an easy win because these bishops actually travel along those squares and check the enemy king. There's nothing that the enemy can do about those bishops, so we win. The king.
King of the who? The Britons.
It's super simple. Basically just moves in a box around it. You can do so on any adjacent board. Doesn't move very far. It's only in adjacent boards, but it's fairly flexible. One thing to note, you can't move your king into a position where another piece could take it. It's a check, and you'd lose if you did so. Just don't do that, and you'll be good to go.
Didn't know we had a king. I thought we were an autonomous collective.
So, the queen. The queen is by far your most valuable piece, both offensively and defensively.
Arguably the most dangerous assassin in the space-time continuum.
You'll find that it's a combination of all of the previous pieces we've covered so far, combined into one space-time assassin. So, let's get into it. The 2D queen moves up, down, left, right, diagonally, all over the place. Now, let's look back through time. 1 board back in time, it'll move 1 square adjacent to its origin. 2 boards back, 2 squares adjacent. 3 boards, 3 squares, expanding out as you go. Now the nice thing about the queen is that it's pretty much the same in any direction through space-time you go. If you go down through parallel dimensions, it's the exact same pattern. Even if you go diagonally through time and parallel boards, it's going to have 1 board away, around it, 2 boards away, 2 squares around it. Not too hard.
From a non-linear, non-subjective viewpoint, it's more like a big ball of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff.
Now, you'll notice that on this bottom board, we are in check through this enemy queen. Now we're not only in check on the present here, but if we look, we're also being checked in the past, because this queen is weaving its way through these open squares all the way to our king, where it would be able to capture it. Thankfully, we're 1 step ahead of our opponent. We have a defensive queen. This queen can actually travel through that empty square onto this square to capture that queen. Boom.
How did you get there? I was talking to you there. No, you were there.
What's he talking about, Harry?
Not only that, we've planned ahead and have an offensive queen. So our opponent has left this nice open diagonal to its king, so we can place our queen there and we check him. Perfect. Takeaway on this, careful of open diagonals to your king.
These side effects can be disastrous.
Pawns. Pretty simple, and their dimensional rules don't come into play all that often, which is good because they're a little weird.
Wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff.
So let's go through it. Basic pawn movement. Pawns can move 1 square forward, they can't go backwards. Pretty simple. They can only attack diagonally, so this pawn can take this piece or this piece. This pawn can't move forward anymore. Now you're probably thinking, hey, wait a second. If I look back, there's no moves for these pawns up here. What gives? Why can't my pawns go anywhere?
Anyone care to explain?
Now, just like in the 2D board, pawns can only advance forward. So what that essentially equates to is pawns are only going to be able to move into boards your opponent has made. In this case, we have 2 timelines active, so we can actually see what's happening here. So this pawn moves 1 board forward, but stays in that same square. Pretty simple, right? These pawns can't move back into these squares because that would be moving back in the parallel boards. Pretty simple. Same thing goes for attacking. Let's say we're the black player here. Okay, our opponent decides, hey, I want this pawn. I'm going to take it through time because this is 5D chess. Why wouldn't I, right? Well, there's a reason why you wouldn't. Because this piece pawn here can go forward and diagonally and take this piece here right back where it was. So if they submit that, we can just go, boom, recapture.
One thing has become clear. This is the darkest, most terrible timeline.
So the main takeaway you should remember for pawns is that if a knight captures it 1 turn in the past, you can recapture with that same pawn from the board that knight left. A little confusing. Thankfully, it doesn't come into play all that often, but it's definitely a good rule to know.
Old woman! Ma'am, sorry. What knight lives in that castle over there?
The knight. We've saved my personal favorite and probably the most complicated piece for last.
Who are you? We are the knights who say... Ni. No, not the knights who say ni.
Don't worry, there's a simple rule to remind you of how the piece moves no matter what. It's 2 plus 1. Let's look at the board. So, on a 2D board, the knight moves 2 squares in one direction and 1 square in another. Creates an L, and that's typically how you'd learn it in classical chess. However, the 2 plus 1 rule helps a little bit more in 5D. So, let's look at it through time. If we go back in time 1 board, it can move 2 squares away from it. 1 plus 2. Perfect. Now, 2 boards back, 1 square away. 2 plus 1. Perfect. Now, 2 boards back, 1 board up, we end up in the same square that it started in. 2 plus 1. Perfect. Same thing in the other direction. 2 boards up, 1 board over.
Perfect.
Same thing. So the knights are very versatile in kind of catching your opponent off guard.
Those who hear them seldom live to tell the tale.
Lots of different tactics you can use. I'll be going through a bunch of different tactics for knights in future videos. But we can look at just a simple move here that might catch your opponent off guard. They might not see this. You got a cheeky little check over here. You might have some follow-up plays after that too. So pretty useful to know about, and you'll find a lot of different unique ways to use your knights. Okay, so we know how the pieces move. We should be good to go, right?
What happens now?
Well, white moves first. You there, D5.
Ooh, ouch. Or not. So how do we avoid getting checkmated in like 3 or 4 turns by a player who has some sneaky and honestly pretty mean tricks up their sleeve? Well, if you come from classic chess, you'll actually be pretty familiar with a safe and powerful opening set of moves. It follows a London system. If you're not familiar with this, don't panic. We're going to go through all of the moves, how to use them, why we use them. So, 2 things before we get going on the moves. First thing, variance. We're going to look at standard or standard turn 0. Don't worry about the difference between the two right now. You'll learn that as you start playing more, but just know they follow a normal set of boards. So let's pick that. Boom. Now, the second thing, this opening can be played for either white or black very comfortably. So don't worry about having to learn 2 different openings out the gate for each color. First step is to protect your F-file pawn. This poor guy starts the game undefended, and we need to fix that. Otherwise, he's going to get blown out of existence by time-traveling queens and bishops, and then we're going to be checkmated before we can even mourn the loss of our poor, beloved F-pawn. So let's figure out how to do that. First things first, we got to defend this poor little guy from the front. So we're just going to place this knight right in front of it, keeps them nice and cozy, and in a few games you'll see these two are going to be best of friends. Like I said, this opening works perfectly fine for black as well, so we're just going to mirror this development. Next up, this pesky little diagonal here. Gotta close that up, and this will help us avoid a lot of other shenanigans. So easiest way to do that, just push your d-file pawn 2 squares. Same thing from black. And now our f-pawn is nice and protected. However, we have this open diagonal to our king. So the last step in this is to close that up so we don't get any sort of queen checkmates. Perfect. From here, you're safe from all sorts of opening traps. You can maybe move your bishop out, get some development on your other pieces, and you're good to go. Stay tuned for future videos where we're going to look at some other more advanced openings, as well as diving deeper into this opening and lines you can use out of it. And there you have it. You're pretty much good to go. I'd recommend playing against the computer for a couple games just to get your head wrapped around all the things that we've covered in this video. But don't linger there for too long. The computer is not good at this game, and you won't really get that deep into the fun stuff until you start playing real people. Where are you going to find real people to play with, you might ask? Jump on the Discord. It's linked within the game itself, as well as down in the description below. There's a great community in 5D chess. Everyone's super friendly, willing to help no matter what, and you'll find yourself a ton of really, really fun games there. And there we have it. Hopefully I've convinced you that this isn't a psychological horror game after all. And really, it's just a fun, silly twist on a classic game of chess. So unless you're in the darkest timeline, hit that like button, subscribe for more videos, and if you have any questions or suggestions for future videos, comment down below, or catch me live on Twitch as I climb the ranks to multi-dimensional Grandmaster. Hope you all have a lovely day, and I'll catch you in the next one.